So thank you for inviting me to speak and to be part of the important discussion you're having today. It's been hugely interesting to read the findings of your report. As your report has done, I think it's really important to nuance our insights into the issues for particular groups. I also think we have to be vigilant about not exceptionalizing these issues as somehow inherent only to faith groups, such as the Sikh community. Research has shown how violence against women is often seen as a cultural norm in Black and minoritized communities, and yet as a cultural anomaly in white communities. So we see it as actions of a homogenous group in the first, and as actions of individuals in the second. And I think we have to guard against such conceptualizations. I think it's important to understand the mediating role of faith in shaping experiences of abuse and the journeys to recovery. And that might include how faith is used to justify abuse in the first place, as well as how it's used to silence those who are subjected to it. So no faith or culture condones violence against women and children, but interpretations of faith and culture create the problem. And I think this has to be our starting point when we examine these issues in particular communities. A focus on faith and culture alone can create greater space for gender to disappear. So with regards to Black and minoritized children, Sadesh asked me to focus on the issues of domestic violence and child sexual abuse. And so I'll aim in this very short time to share some thoughts from research. Given the nature and extent and nature of male violence against women, it's not surprising that this constitutes a major source of harm for children. And so issues for children and young people have to be situated within this wider phenomena, which creates a regime of fear, coercion and abuse also for them. So children only began to be considered in their own right from the mid-1990s, and a body of research has developed since then, but research on Black and minoritized groups is limited. Harm to children as a result of domestic violence was only acknowledged in the 2002 Child and Adoption Act, and the Domestic Violence Act now recognizes children as victims in their own right. In practice, work has consistently shown that specialist services for all children are underdeveloped and inadequate. And for Black and minoritized children, this is even more the case. Even where services exist, these are short-term, overstretched, and not always set up for diverse groups. And this won't surprise you. And despite attempts to address the impact of domestic violence on children, there remain considerable silos in current responses. So Marianne Hester talks about the three planets, that's the planets of child protection, child contact and domestic violence, and the lack of linkage between these different arenas. So even whilst we aim to protect children in the child protection arena, and we know that there's a high volume of domestic violence police notifications, we expose many to continuing abuse in the child contact arena, for example. And also, in order to not run the risk of seeing Black and minoritized children's issues as exceptional, we must consider the common issues for all children growing up in contexts of abuse, but also how the overlay of structural factors such as racism and cultural context create additional factors that require our extension, both in their experiences of abuse and in the responses that they receive from professionals. It's also important, as we've been urged, to not simply regard children as victims, but as having their own perspectives, both about their experiences, but also about solutions. The children's perspective literature tells us three things. Firstly, that children want to talk and be listened to. but the ways we work can further silence them. They want to be safe, but there are few services for them. And children and young people want to be part of solutions, but we often ignore and overlook them. So we know that there's a large number of children affected. It's a substantial problem and it's not a small issue. In terms of prevalence, as you can see here, the NSPC study on child abuse and neglect in the UK reported 12% of under 11, 17.5% of 11 to 17-year-olds, and 23.7% of 18 to 24-year-olds had been exposed to domestic violence between adults in their homes in their childhood. And males accounted for 94% of the perpetration. Children maltreated by a parent or guardian were more likely to be polyvictims and experience other types of abuse from other perpetrators in the home, in schools, and in communities. So just moving on to look at issues for Black and minoritized children, the wide-ranging effects of indirect and direct abuse are now widely recognized. We don't have focused research on Black and minoritized children, and there's a need to conduct more robust research on this issue. However, we can extrapolate from existing research that domestic violence is experienced over a longer period, is more frequent and more serious for South Asian groups. And this raises particular issues for children in those groups. Firstly, there's a greater exposure to violence and abuse. So South Asian women are more likely to be subjected to abuse from multiple family members alongside their partners. And this has obvious implications for children on whom pressure is placed by more than just their abusive fathers. They're often the site of abusers' manipulation and more likely to be emotionally confused as a result of greater numbers of people being involved. And of course, this creates divided loyalties and is part of the coercive context and regimes of fear that they live with. And due to greater barriers, women stay longer in abuse and experience more extreme and frequent abuse. And this was daily for 44% of women in one study. And they especially report higher levels of extreme isolation. Now, the longer abuse goes on, the more likely children will see it, get caught up in it, and become victims of direct abuse. And children exposed to severe or persistent abuse show greater signs of PTSD through intrusive recall of events, flashbacks, avoidant or numbed responses, hypervigilance, inability to concentrate, watchfulness, and disturbed sleep, amongst other symptoms. Secondly, children become weapons of abuse. Threats of separation from children is frequently reported by Black and minoritized women, where men make repeated threats to take children, including overseas. And in this way, children are weaponized in abuse against women. They're often used in the post-separation period to monitor and control women and even to be abusive. In one study, men were reported to place tremendous pressure on children to condemn women who made the decision to leave abusive situations. Children can have torn loyalties, which are exploited by abusers, and child contact is an arena which is known to reinforce abuse on an ongoing basis. Children living with post-separation abuse, and this was 78% in one of our studies, such children are considered amongst the most distressed in the population, displaying high levels of behavioural and emotional disturbance and persistent depression. And children might have grown up in situations where their relationship with their mothers is deliberately eroded. And again, our research highlights this is especially an issue for South Asian children. Just move on to talk quickly about child sexual abuse. With regards to CSA, there's been a lot of attention on CSA perpetrated by high-profile figures and celebrities, as well as cases of child sexual exploitation in Rotherham and other English cities. And of course, although hugely important, such cases can displace the everyday experiences of CSA. So we know that the overwhelming majority of harm to children is perpetrated by those known to them and not strangers. And it's the very routinized and normalized nature of such abuse that creates enduring effects, particularly when they're not addressed by those closest to them and where children aren't supported by services. And you'll be aware that building an accurate picture of CSA is complicated. The Centre of Expertise shows that self-reported CSA is significantly higher than that recorded by agencies. And minimum estimates of CSA are between 15 to 20% for girls and 7 to 8% for boys. Of course, your report shows a much higher percentage of 35% of those who responded saying that they had experienced CSA, which has to be of concern to us. And also highlighted in the literature is the gendered nature of CSA. This shows the majority of victims are girls, so anything between 66 to 88%, and the majority of perpetrators are men who are over 18, so between 97 to 98%. And the figures in your report are also in line with these figures at 87%. The most serious and repeated offences are committed by known people. So typically this is family members for girls and young women and authority figures for boys and young men. So I just want to talk a little bit about the greater barriers to disclosure that are faced by Black and minoritized children and young people. As well as structural and institutional barriers, cultural factors, especially culturally mediated shame, so sharam, and izzat, referring to reputation, act as barriers to disclosure and help seeking for particularly South Asian children. Community gossip and loss of reputation are big factors and mean that they are less likely to seek help from professionals and rely on their own families and friends. Huge pressure to keep things in the family exists. So secrecy and conspiracy of silence, which are big issues in domestic violence and CSA for all groups, are even greater issues here. In our study, although they were upset by their experiences of living with domestic violence, many of the older children said they kept it to themselves, referring to it as keeping it inside, and hence internalized the shame and guilt. And the widespread underdevelopment of services for Black and minoritized children, of course, makes this all the more concerning. Silencing of CSA is profound. When we look at CSE as a particular form of CSA, it's easier to point the finger at others outside of the community. But the fact is that most CSA occurs within a familial setting. It's knitted into the everyday routines that children have within their families and within their social networks. So in terms of effects on children, young people, I refer to these as same and different issues. So children's responses to both forms of violence and abuse vary, and the stage of development, the presence of protective factors and other considerations will influence the consequences for them. When children are also facing other forms of discrimination, such as poverty, racism or homophobia, these harmful impacts will be compounded. For Black and minoritized children, a lack of professional understanding about their cultural context, where their issues can be seen as too complex and reduced to a backlash against oppressive cultures, has meant that they have difficulties in accessing affirming support, which adds to their distress and harm. So we know that the complicated impact of domestic violence and child sexual abuse may manifest in a range of emotional, social, psychological, and behavioral responses, which have both short and long-term implications. The greater children's exposure, so the greater children's exposure is, the poorer their development outcomes will be, including those related to learning and educational development. And all forms of abuse in childhood are associated with poorer mental health, so poorer emotional well-being, current thoughts about self-harm and suicide ideation, as well as involvement in other forms of criminality. When children's own experiences have been explored, they reveal a confusing range of feelings that include fear, anger, sadness, terror, loss, torn loyalty, responsibility, helplessness, despair, worry, and guilt. Now that's a lot of feelings for children to carry, and these often result in profound feelings of shame and powerlessness. And this range of effects endure unless interventions are made and the issues addressed. Children recover, though, when they're no longer exposed to abuse. And I've already mentioned the lack of funding for work with children, and this sits alongside the systemic underinvestment in dedicated Black and minoritized services, which so many find invaluable. We have all also heard about the long CAMS waiting lists, but even when Black and minoritized children get there, there's a chronic lack of understanding about their intersectional issues. And you may want to look out for the new campaign, the new women's campaign called Deserve to be Heard, which highlights the impact of domestic abuse on the mental health of women and children. In terms of professional responses, particularly to child sexual abuse, our recent research on sexual violence highlighted the collusion between families and professionals in reinforcing silence, secrecy, and denial, however unwitting that might be. When children try to speak to professionals, their experiences can sometimes be reframed as cultural issues such as forced marriage, or they're forced to confront their families. It's only when they manage to reach a specialist Black or minoritized service that they get the help that they need. And I include a quote here from one of the young people that we interviewed in this report. And she highlights this issue, I think, really clearly about the collusion that can occur between families and professionals. So overall, the picture we have is one of underdevelopment, of appropriate professional responses, and of adequate dedicated services for Black and minoritized children, and even sometimes a lack of understanding of how they are impacted. And I think other dimensions also need to be looked at when we're looking at violence and abuse in children and young people's lives. And this includes abuse in young people's relationships, which is of huge concern, but we know little for groups such as South Asian young people. And online and digital abuse is a growing issue. So if children can't speak to those closest to them through being silenced, then they turn to online spaces, and this puts them in further vulnerable contexts. And again, we need to have more work done on this to find out what the specific issues are for Black and minoritized children and young people. So just to conclude then, the issue of abuse in children's lives is not a small one, and it's not a new one. It can't be ignored or pushed underground. It's an issue we have yet to grasp effectively, but all of us have to do something about it urgently in our different community and professional spaces. including commissioning spaces. And change can't happen unless we talk about it and act. Just as climate change and justice is a pressing issue for our future generations, so is ensuring the physical and emotional well-being of our future generations. And I think we just have to do better. Thank you for listening.